What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to the Underdog Podcast. Today, I have my Week 3 power rankings for you. I apologize for the little bit later release date. I was planning on releasing it a little bit earlier today, but we have an evening release for you guys. Just a reminder of how my power rankings work. I view these teams, not based on standings, more so of like how they played week in and week out. Standings don't really have an effect on this ranking. You can win and play bad. You can also lose and still play really well and move up or down, even if you move down if you win or move up if you lose. You'll see some examples of that here today. I also think that if you want to go look at the standings, just go ahead and look at them. They don't really have an effect on this series or this ranking, whatsoever. So that would be the place to go if you are looking for the standings. But without further ado, let's get into my Week 3 power rankings, starting off with my number 32 team. We are sticking with the New Orleans Saints. Sorry, Saints fans, you're still at the bottom, unfortunately. And I think that the biggest takeaway that you can take away from this game against the 49ers is that you kept it close. I think that the Saints are a bit of a feistier team than I maybe gave them credit for coming into the season. I still think that they by far have the worst roster in the NFL, but Spencer Rattler put together a couple of drives, and you could see, Kellen Moore and this offense kind of getting a little bit more comfortable this week. And I felt like the defense, kept them in this game by allowing San Francisco to really, put it on them. Granted, it was against Mac Jones, so, take that with a little bit of grain of salt. But I think that the Saints fans, you should be a little bit more encouraged this week, despite staying at the 32 ranking here. Moving on to my number 31 team, dropping a spot, I have the Tennessee Titans. And it really pains me to drop them because I thought that they played fairly well in this game. They were without J.C. Latham and Tavondre Sweat. I think those are two of the bigger pieces on their team. Cam Ward is staying afloat, and I think that's about, as good as you could hope considering the weapons that he came in with, the question mark at coaching with Brian Callahan, who's still a pretty big question mark for this team, and the O-line being just, kind of mediocre. So I think that Cam Ward, him staying afloat is a good sign, and he had a really sick touchdown pass to Eli Manor in this game, and I think that the defense is still going to be really good. I think that they gave Rams fits for about 3 quarters, and then the Rams kind of pulled away. But I still think that this defense has a good bit of talent on it. Like I said, the biggest question mark, I think, is Brian Callahan as your coach, and this team still lacks a pretty big identity. We don't really know what this Titans team is, and they're running out of time to figure it out in this Brian Callahan era, and I don't know how much longer it will last. Moving on to our number 30 team, we have the Cleveland Browns dropping 3 spots, and I think this defense is still, closer to what it was in 2023. They were able to hang in there with Baltimore until about the fourth quarter, kind of similar to Tennessee against the Rams. And you can't really ask much more from this defense. Despite the rankings up there for, Cleveland, I think they might have the worst offense in the league. Their ability to, run the football is still, pretty questionable. And for Kevin Stefanski being deemed, an offensive guru, how far do you go with this Joe Flacco experiment that I was very critical of at the beginning of the year? I just didn't really see the point in starting Flacco. I thought that starting Gabriel or Shador or even Kenny Pickett, who's no longer on the team, would be, better options than starting Joe Flacco. And it's too bad that Pickett got hurt. We never really got to see what he could be, in Cleveland here. But, I think that the Browns, you can hang your hat on having a really good defense, and, they'll probably win you a couple games, but, they're going to drop a couple spots here, unfortunately. Moving on to my number 29 team, moving up 2 spots, I have the Miami Dolphins. And the Dolphins looked a little bit better on offense this week. I think, Tua still threw a really terrible pick at the end of the game right to Marte Mapu. Didn't see him at all. but I thought that he played, solidly throughout this game. He had a couple of big plays to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, taking advantage of, some off coverage that the Patriots played a lot of. And I thought they got Achane going, and, McDaniel kind of, retooled, the offense, compared to last week, and they got him humming. But, McDaniel, I don't know, man. I felt like his halftime interview, he just looked like he was like on a different planet, honestly. And I wonder, how like locked in he is on this team. I still think that this defense is really bad. I mean, the secondary was just getting destroyed against Drake May. And, you wonder if they get just blown the doors off by Buffalo, if they just clean house completely with, firing McDaniel, firing Chris Greer, and just kind of starting over. That's something maybe to look for in this Thursday night football game. I think the Bills are favored by 13.5 or 14.5 points right now. So a very large spread. You don't really see that this early on in the season. So I would expect Miami to get boat raced in that game. Moving on to my number 28 team staying put is the Carolina Panthers. I see a lot of people really criticizing this team, and they didn't really have a great first half. I think Jatavion Sanders had a brutal drop, and I think Xavier Legette had a couple of brutal moments too, especially, I think there was some criticism for him, not hustling back to the ball at the end of the game. That's a story right now. I thought Bryce settled in more so in the second half, especially after they got that interception off Kyler, and they showed some promise in the second half, but they just have to get more consistent on offense and a faster start, and I hope that Dave Canales and Bryce Young can figure this out. And shout out to the defense in the second half, kind of, stonewalling the Cardinals' offense. I think that, they were definitely by far the worst defense heading into the league for me this season, and they, maybe stepped up a little bit there where they could against the Cardinals, so shout out to them. Moving on to my number 27 team, dropping 2 spots from last week, I have the New York Jets. And the Justin Fields magic left as fast as it came. The Jets' offense was completely inept against the Buffalo Bills defense, and despite not having Ed Oliver, they had a little bit of success running the football, but definitely not as much as last week, and they could not throw the ball at all. They could not move the ball at all against Buffalo. And I thought that it was pretty interesting. If you watched the broadcast, Tony Romo was talking about how predictable the Jets defense is because they don't do a lot of pre-snap rotation and disguise that's kind of taken over the league. Aaron Glenn's pretty, set with, pre-snap what he's going to run, and he's, daring you to beat it. And I think that causes a lot of problems, especially against Josh Allen, who's a premier quarterback in this league. And when you go up against those premium quarterbacks, you're going to get grilled if you stay in the same coverage pre-snap and don't do, any adjustments at all. So I think that the Jets, will get this defense figured out, but, it's just how soon are they going to end up getting them figured out is the question. Moving on to my number 26 team, moving up 3 spots from last week, I have the New York Giants. And Brian Daboll, thank you. Thank you very much for coming out there and showing the world that you can still coach damn well. And Russell Wilson, shout out to him. He looked really, really good in this game despite, having the heat check in overtime and, throwing the pick. But Russ was really good in this game. He showed off the deep ball. That's always been a strength of his career, and I felt like he had a really good game. One of his best games in a really long time. Malik Neighbors was an absolute demon out there. He was uncoverable. He had an awesome game for the Giants. It was great to see him getting the ball. Wan'Dale Robinson, which was a draft pick that I really criticized back in the day, he showed some juice out there and was able to, make some plays for this team, and Cam Scatterby was running over dudes like it's his job. So I think that the Giants offensively have, a little bit going for them into next week. And then as far as the defense is concerned, Shane Bowen, what are we doing here, man, with this premium D-line and giving up, that many points to Dallas? That's inexcusable. They got to get that fixed. And I felt like, they got to Dak a little bit, but they didn't get to him as much as I thought they would. And, I hope that, next week against KC, they're really going to need a big performance from that D-line to have a shot in that game. So, I hope that they can show up to, the bell, next week for the Giants. Moving on to my number 25 team, dropping 2 spots from last week, I have the Chicago Bears. And Bears fans, it's brutal out there, man. I really feel for you. I thought that this game would be closer than it was. I didn't think the Bears would cover, but I thought it would be, maybe a 1-score game or a 10-point loss, but they got boat raced in this game. And I think it's not really an indictment on Ben Johnson or Caleb Williams or even Dennis Allen. I think it's more of an indictment on Ryan Poles in this front office and just the fact that they, in the first 2 rounds, decided to get a pass-catching tight end when when Cole Kmet, he's fine, but he's nothing special. And, grab a Luther Burden when you didn't really need either of those guys on your team and you didn't decide to beef up the defense at all. They kind of neglected him other than getting like Dio Ogbonnibo, who's been pretty good. But, the Bears just got picked apart and, I think that there's gonna be some real turmoil in Chicago if they don't, get this around soon because it's a big market and the media is gonna go nuts. And I don't think Caleb has looked like particularly like awful. I also don't think he's been good. I think he's just kind of fluctuating, kind of had the ups and downs, and I think that they've got to correct that sooner rather than later. Moving on to my number 24 team, moving up 2 spots from last week, I have the New England Patriots, and it was a joy to see them finally beat Tua Tagovailoa, or I guess beat the Dolphins when Tua starts, but I don't have to hear that Tua's undefeated against the Pats anymore, thank God. And Drake May was awesome in this game, man. He was super consistent, only 4 incompletions, 3 total touchdowns. He was a demon out there, man, picking apart that Miami secondary, which albeit is one of the worst in the league, but don't care. That was a great performance from him. Shout out Ramondre Stevenson. I always believed in you. I thought that the Travion Henderson pick did not make any sense at the time, and that's exactly why, because you got really good contributions from both Ramondre Stevenson and Antonio Gibson, who had an awesome kickoff return for a touchdown that really, kind of propelled the Patriots to victory there. Travion Henderson, had a, kind of a brutal game, especially in pass protection wise. And I just always felt like Ramondre, when given the opportunity, when he's healthy, is a really good starting running back. And he kind of proved that, for them this week. And, defensively, I don't know if it was the new play caller or what, or still missing Gonzalez, but it was brutal, man. They were giving up some big, big plays to Miami in the pass game. Felt like they were playing way too much off coverage, not going to that, press man style that we've come accustomed to here in New England. And the linebackers are just brutal, man. Robert Spillane and Christian Ellis have been awful to start the season. Shout out Milton Williams and Christian Barmore, though. They had awesome games for the Patriots, on Sunday. And shout out the offensive line. 2 pressures the whole game allowed by them, and Jared Wilson and Will Campbell were clean. That's awesome to see if you're a Patriots fan like I am. Moving on to my number 23 team, dropping a spot. It is the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, I will say the Jags, I think, played pretty well, and they're more so dropping because of some other teams playing well. I thought that, the offense looked decent. I don't know what's going on with Brian Thomas Jr. shying away from contact. I think Liam Cohen said that he had a wrist injury coming in, but I'm kind of one of those people where you got to put your body on the line for your teammates, regardless of what you're dealing with. If you're out there, you got to, do your best to try and help your team win a football game. And BTJ, for whatever reason, just was making business decisions out there. But, I think Travis Etienne continues to look really well. for that Jags offense. I still think they got to find a way to get the ball to BTJ more. They were trying at least. He just kind of made some business decisions. And Travis Hunter has not been able to really make an impact on either side of the ball. I will say they kind of got screwed, and Travis Hunter got screwed because that was not defensive pass interference on him, and that kind of set up Cincinnati for the game-winning touchdown. I will say that, but other than that, I think that Jacksonville played pretty well. Josh Hines-Allen continues to be a force for that defense. Speaking of the Cincinnati Bengals, they're coming in at number 22, dropping 5 spots. And this has more to do with the fact that Joe Burrow is hurt rather than their performance on Sunday. And Bengals fans, you can get upset in the comments below, but when you lose a top 4 quarterback in the league, it's going to really show. And I think that this team's going to be, okay with Jake Browning. I don't think they're going to be, what they were with Joe Burrow offensively, but I think Jake Browning has proven that he can, kind of come in and keep their season afloat. And I think if they can stick around 500, 9 wins could be good enough for them to get into the playoffs here in the AFC. We'll just have to see. But, I thought that it was good that they got Jamar Chase really involved in this game, after kind of having a, down week in week 1. I felt like that was good. They have a matchup against Carson Wentz, down in Minnesota. It's going to be interesting with how they do with Brian Flores, and, with Shamar Stewart out, can they get the pass rush that they need outside of Trey Hendrickson? We'll just have to see there with the Cincinnati Bengals going into next week. Moving on to my number 21 team, I have the Las Vegas Raiders dropping 2 spots. And again, similar to the Bengals, not really injury-related, but I was just more impressed with other teams. I think people are going to rip Geno to shreds, especially after I was hyping him up last week. But I really don't think Geno was that bad in this game. I felt like he was under siege the whole night. I felt like their pass pro for Vegas was really mediocre. They couldn't run the ball. And they kind of invested a whole lot in Genti, and they still haven't been able to figure out how to run the ball. And I think, you're going to see 3 interceptions for Geno. The first one was really bad. He just didn't see the linebacker. The second one was an arm punt at the end of the half, and it was a pretty damn good ball from Geno. The receiver just didn't make a play on it. I can't remember who it was off the top of my head he was throwing to. It might have been Thornton or Tucker. I think it was one of those two. And then the third one was tipped, and it should have been caught. And, so I don't think that Geno was that bad. And I thought that this defense really, kind of stepped up, especially in the second half. They kind of figured out that Chargers offense a little bit. Max Crosby made a big play. I mean, really, it was kind of a exchange from Herbert and Hampton, but, Max Crosby was in on it, made a big play to try and, propel the Raiders back into this game, which unfortunately they couldn't take advantage of. But I think the Raiders are still a good football team, and despite the loss, I think that they're still, in a position to be competitive week in and week out. Moving on to my number 20 team, I have the Seattle Seahawks moving up 4 spots. And let me just say that Seahawks fans, I was pretty low on this team coming into the year, especially offensively, and I think that they somewhat answered that bell, this week. Kenneth Walker looks healthy. Him and Zach Charbonnet as a duo look really good. Sam Darnold looked really good. JSN continues to look really good, and they spread the ball around more in this game. They got a little bit lucky, I'll say, with Pittsburgh and Caleb Johnson kind of not understanding the new kickoff rules, but they still earned this victory on the road in a tough place to play against Pittsburgh, and this defense still looks pretty good. Mike McDonald's kind of locked in with this defense, so I think that Seattle is looking on the upward trajectory, and they've got the Saints, this upcoming week, and I expect them to win that game in big fashion and continue to, build. The NFC West is going to be a tough division. It usually is, and Seattle, they're going to have to try and keep pace there, and, if they continue to play like they did against Pittsburgh, they will. Moving on to my number 19 team, moving up 1 spot, is the Dallas Cowboys. Again, I was higher on this team than most people were, especially after the Micah Parsons trade, and you saw why in that game against the Giants. Dak Prescott was awesome, man. He's a bona fide top 10 starter in this league. He looked really good against the Giants. He made some awesome throws. CeeDee Lamb had a great game. They got George Pickens more involved. He had a really good game. And their ability, surprisingly, to run the football has been, I think, the biggest key for Dallas. They need to continue to be able to do that. Javonte Williams looks rejuvenated. He has juice again. He's not the slow, can't, accelerate, can't juke guy that we saw in Denver last season. And I think that this defense, despite, really like giving up a ton of points to the Giants, I think the Deron Bland injury hurt them this week, and you saw that in the secondary. I think that they'll bounce back next week against a struggling Chicago Bears team. Moving on to my number 18 team, the biggest faller of the week, dropping 7 spots. I have the Minnesota Vikings. Again, this is due to both how they played and the J.J. McCarthy injury. He's going to miss between 2 to 4 weeks with a high ankle sprain, so they're going to be running out Carson Wentz at starting quarterback in 25. Yikes. That's all I got to say about that one. And, Aaron Jones also banged up, I believe, after this game, so that kind of takes a hit to their run game a little bit. I'd like to see them try and, get Jordan Mason more touches like they did in week 1. And this team's just got to get the ball to Justin Jefferson and TJ Hawkinson more and, their playmakers. And I think the play of McCarthy has been holding them back. You could argue it's probably bottom 3 in the league. And it's about what I expected. J.J. McCarthy missing all of last season. It's a little bit underdeveloped. It's very inconsistent. And, but you still continue to see the flashes of his game. And I think that, this is a slight setback for him. But I think once he gets in there and more comfortable with the offense, you'll start to see this offense, improve greatly, I think. And this defense is still really good. I think that they gave up a lot of, yards on the ground, but that's because Bijan is just really good, man. I think that Flores this week, it's a good matchup for them against Cincinnati, and I think that, he can continue to dial up pressure. He was missing Van Ginkel and Cashman. Hopefully he can get those guys back and continue to, produce one of the best coached defenses in the league. Moving on to my number 17 team, moving up 4 spots. One of the bigger risers of the week, I have the Atlanta Falcons. And they looked really good against Minnesota. I'll put my hand up. I thought there was no way Minnesota was going to lose this game at home. I thought it was a bad matchup for Atlanta, and they came out there and they punched Minnesota in the mouth. And shout out this defense, man. I was way out on Raheem Morris as a head coach. I just felt like his defenses really hadn't lived up to the hype the last 3 years. And, particularly we saw that last year with Atlanta. They look really good, man. They're firing on all cylinders. That rookie class that they had a hell of a game last night. Billy Bowman had an interception. Xavier Watts had an interception. Jalen Walker had a sack, and James Pierce had half a sack. So they look like they have a really good defensive class coming in here to help rejuvenate that defense. They have a pass rush, which is a miracle. Atlanta, I feel like it's been forever since they've had a pass rush. Felt like it's been since like the Vic Beasley days that they haven't had a pass rush. So that's good to see for them. And offensively, I think they didn't do anything like too impressive other than Bijan just probably being the best running back in the league at this point in time. But, Penix kind of just kept it low-key and took care of the football, and they were able to, get themselves a nice win here on the road against Minnesota. And they look to, build momentum in a tough, NFC South with Tampa Bay there. Moving on to number 16, staying put, I have the Arizona Cardinals. I thought about moving this team down further, but I kept them where they were. I felt like first half they really, they were able to stick to the game script, have a really nice, run game there with James Conner, mixing in Kyler Murray and Trey Benson. And they just kind of slowed down in the second half, especially after that Kyler pick. I think the biggest key for Arizona is going to be, can they play 60 minutes on both sides of the football? I think you saw about 35 good minutes from the offense and about 35 good minutes from the defense. I think that they need to really put this all together in order to, kind of climb these ranks of this team and be a playoff team and, an NFC that's going to be pretty competitive. So I think that's the biggest thing with Arizona here, and they got to get the ball to Marvin Harrison, man. I mean, that's another big thing they got to do. They got to get the ball into the hands of their premium receiver there. Jonathan Gannon, after the game, he said that, the ball's going to go where the ball's going to go, which is true. You can only, the ball's going to go where, it's designed to go. But I think they just need to design more things for Marvin Harrison, keep him in the game. And, I think he can be a true game changer for this team. We all know his talent. They just have to, utilize it. Moving on to my number 15 team, also staying put out of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think they got a bit unlucky, this week. Just kind of a boneheaded play by Caleb Johnson, who's further in the doghouse after fumbling last week and then, giving up that free touchdown to Seattle. I think this was, a bad matchup for them because Seattle came at them with pressure. They couldn't really block, the pressure that they brought. And Rodgers, at this point in time, at his age, it's really tough to maneuver around that pressure. I think they need to get DK Metcalf going, and they need to find some semblance of a run game to take the pressure off of Aaron Rodgers, which is really hurting them right now. And, Caleb Johnson doing dumb stuff like that isn't going to get him on the field to help that run game because Jaylen Warren is a solid runner, but he's not like game-changing. I feel like his dynamism comes more in the pass game. And this defense, man, brutal for the second week in a row, but history would tell you that Mike Tomlin and Terrell Austin can figure it out, but they better figure it out sooner than later because you can't keep continuing to give up yards like that and expect to win football games for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Moving on to number 14, staying put as well, I have the Houston Texans. And again, thought about dropping them, but I was hesitant to do so. I think that the biggest thing in this game is that the Texans just have to get the offense going sooner. I thought that C.J. Stroud played really well in that, in that fourth quarter. He had a couple of misses throughout the game, though, and he just doesn't look comfortable with that offensive line that, for whatever reason, they decided to trade Laramie Tunsil away, a premium left tackle, and then roll with Arante Ursary and not really fix it. And, that's just not really going to fly, and their run game is just limited with, Nick Chubb not really having a lot of juice, and, Woody Marks brought the juice when he was in there. I'd like to see them get him more carries, and, you just got to get the football in the hands of your playmakers. Nico Collins isn't touching the football enough. Jaden Higgins, they went into the fourth quarter to get him the ball, and he had an awesome run after the catch. Get him the ball more, and Jalen Noel had a big punt return in this game. Get him the ball more. Xavier Hutchinson looked good. Get him the ball more. You just got to get your playmakers in the ball more. I'm not worried about this defense at all. They buckled down. They made some really big stops. Derek Stingley did a pretty good job against Mike Evans. Daniil Hunter and Will Anderson were wreaking havoc in this game. I think Baker just kind of came up big in clutch time, and I think that they just have to figure out this offense. This is a huge game for them at Jacksonville. They really need this one if they're going to, stay in contention for the AFC South and stay in contention for a playoff spot. Big week coming up for the Houston Texans. Moving on to my number 13 team, dropping 3 spots, is the Washington Commanders, who looked inept against the Green Bay Packers for the most part offensively. They still can't get the ball to Terry McLaurin. I thought Debo has looked good the last 2 weeks. They've kind of designed touches for him, and he's made some plays after the catch. Kind of going back to that old Debo that we know and love. But the Eckler injury is brutal. The Dietrich Wise injury also brutal. I'm just kind of I don't know, man. I'm pretty out on the Commanders. It also doesn't sound like Jaden Daniels is going to play this week with that sprained knee, so that's another wrinkle you got to throw in there. And I know that they ran the ball well against the Giants. They could not run the ball at all against that Green Bay Packers front. And, I worry about their continuation to run the football throughout the season. And defensively, I thought that, they had some moments there. I think that they, had a brutal busted coverage on the Tucker Kraft seam ball. But I felt like defensively they were able to kind of hang in there, and, Dan Quinn, kept those guys in a position to, try and come back in this game. But Jaden Daniels in the offense, they look brutal. Jeff Hafley had them in hell for sure. Moving on to my number 12 team, moving up 1 spot, I have the Denver Broncos. And brutal way to lose the football game. Let me start off with that on a leverage call that, I think a lot of people are saying is ticky-tack, but if you touch the center, like, it should be called, at least if you look at the rule book. It's not always called. It's a pretty inconsistent call, so I understand that, Broncos fans are upset about it. But regardless, I think they looked better, especially offensively. I still am not the biggest fan of Bo Nix, but, this team's ability to run the ball is taking some pressure off of him. Cortland Sutton looks good. Troy Franklin looks good. And defensively, they're still really good, and it was just somewhat of a bad matchup for them. I think that the Colts had, kind of the offense to really, compete there with them, and, they weren't able to get pressure on Daniel Jones, and he was able to make some plays for them. But I do think that, we're going to find out a lot about this Broncos team coming this week against the Los Angeles Chargers. That's going to be a really, really good game to see where they're at as a team. Speaking of the Indianapolis Colts, they are the biggest riser again this week, moving up 7 spots to be my number 11 team. And what can I say, man? Daniel Jones he looks really good, man. And Shane Steichen, can coach. And I had this team, only at like 7-10, just because I was, a little concerned about, Daniel Jones starting, about the ceiling of this offense. That was clearly, wrong. Shane Steichen is really getting the most out of this offense that he possibly can. Jonathan Taylor had an awesome game, man. He was cooking that Broncos defense. Josh Downs woke up. We even saw Daniel Jones, fire down the field to Alec Pierce, getting that, involved in their pass game, which was kind of a big part of it last year with Richardson. So I like to see that element, back in there. And Tyler Warren looks like the front runner for Rookie of the Year early. He looks awesome, man. And, Colson Loveland going before him looks like a really bad decision by the Bears right now. I know it's only 2 weeks in. But, got to say that. Defense, kind of stepped up big, in the fourth quarter, really, giving this team a chance to win that football game. Led by DeForest Buckner, who had a really, really good game for the Colts. I expect them to continue to, play like this. And Shane Steichen has always been a really good coach. I've always thought he's a really good coach. This team nearly made the playoffs with Gardner Minshew 2 years ago, and then nearly made the playoffs with, Anthony Richardson and who's the other guy that played for them? I can't remember off the top of my head, but nearly made the playoffs both those years. So I think that Shane Steichen's a heck of a coach, and the Colts will continue to play at a high level of football. Moving on to my number 10 team, I have the San Francisco 49ers moving up 2 spots. Big win for them. I know it was only against the Saints, 32 team, but anytime you get a win with a backup quarterback, it's a big win. But, injuries still plaguing this team. I think Juwan Jennings got banged up in this game, so that really only leaves like Ricky Pearsall left for them, as a weapon. CMC had a good game. I think that he'll, get more comfortable with his body as, the season goes on. And, this defense, I think, played pretty well here, but this is a really underrated team. If they start making a run here, like, they could easily like make some noise in the NFC, especially if Mac Jones keeps giving them, good solid quarterback play. And, Kyle Shanahan, he's a heck of a coach, man. And, as always, despite, the injury really plaguing this franchise, has been able to keep his teams really competitive. So I think that, if the 49ers can just, win a couple more games, missing Purdy, I think that they're going to be a dangerous team in the NFC. Moving on to my number 9 team, dropping down 2 spots, I have the Kansas City Chiefs, and I think a lot of people are going to be calling for them to move down even further, but I'm going to, pump the brakes on that a little bit. I think that the biggest thing I can say about this offense is it's going to improve. And I think the biggest reason why is that, Worthy, I think he's like week to week right now. He might even be back next week, so that'll give you, one of your receivers back, because right now it's currently like Tyquan Thornton, Juju Smith-Schuster, and Travis Kelce, and that's about it. And, you get Rashee Rice back after week 6, but, you have a really tough stretch here at the beginning of the year, so you wonder, like, how far the Chiefs are going to fall, but, or how well they can rebound in the second half of the season. But I think that I wouldn't be too worried about this offense. I think Andy Reid and Mahomes have more than earned the benefit of the doubt there. I think the defense is still a question mark. They still can't get a pass rush going. Chris Jones hasn't been that same guy that he has been, and Karlaftis hasn't really been that kind of Robin to, Chris Jones being Batman. And the secondary still, is a little bit, kind of even though Philly didn't really pass the ball a whole lot, I'm still not loving what I'm seeing there. So I think Spags has to get that figured out in order for this team to, be what we know they can be, and that's, a bona fide Super Bowl contender. Moving on to my number 8 team, I have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers moving up a spot. And Tampa, I think you saw what this team could be yesterday, and that is a legitimate Super Bowl contender. Baker Mayfield, that last drive gave me goosebumps. He was awesome on that drive. Big play after big play. And, they probably should have won the game by more points. They kind of let Houston back into it, but nonetheless, Baker, crunch time, big time plays. Bucky Irving had a really good game, despite kind of some slower games from, Mike Evans and Cade Otton. Emeka Egbuka still showed out. In this defense, Todd Bowles got him playing pretty well. They were on Stroud all night, and they let up a couple of big plays. The Jaden Higgins one, and the special teams played to Jalen Noel. But other than that, this team was really good. And the Bucs could be dangerous, man. You got the Jets and Tyrod Taylor. It could be 3-0. Bucs could be in play for that 1 seed, man. They're that good of a football team, in my opinion. Moving on to my number 7 team, climbing up a spot, I have the Detroit Lions. It was great to see them rebound from playing the Packers and really taking it to the Bears, and they put on a show. They were, fired up for the Ben Johnson revenge game, and, they were saying, we're going to boo him and stuff like that, and they came out there and they backed up all the trash talk that they had. And it was good to see Jared Goff, kind of return to form and really, pick apart that Bears defense. Amon-Ra had a field day out there. They were able to run the ball this week with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. So that was a big, pointer that they got right this week. And defensively, they still looked really good. I wonder, how good this Lions team can be. I had them, I believe, at 3 coming into the season. We'll see if they can get that high, but it was a good bounce back week for Detroit to able to reestablish their offense, reestablish their defense, and just kind of a get right week for them. They got a big game coming up against Baltimore on Monday night. Traveling to M&T Bank Stadium, so we'll see. If that production that they had this week is going to continue into next week into a really good Ravens team. Moving on to my number 6 team, staying put, is the Los Angeles Chargers. Really liked what I saw out of Justin Herbert for the 2nd week in a row, dishing the ball around, looking really comfortable back there, making really good reads, really good throws, getting Keenan Allen involved, getting Ladd McConkey involved. I like what I saw again from Justin Herbert, who just looks to be getting better and better, here for the Chargers. I still question their ability to run the ball, especially that's what, Harbaugh kind of is predicated on, is, running the football. They couldn't really do that with Hampton or Najee, so that has me worried a little bit. But Jesse Minter continues to just, find ways to work with minimum amount of talent and produce a really good defense. Tarheeb still was awesome in this game, and despite Khalil Mack going down, they were still able to pressure Geno in that second half and give him fits. So really good game here from the Chargers. And also Quentin Johnston, I never quit you. He's got hands. He looks really, really good, and that's a really good group of weapons there. If QJ can be what he was coming out of TCU, him, Keenan Allen, and Ladd McConkey's a really good trio. So I hope that, he continues to play that, like that, because I know that, he's received a lot of criticism from Chargers fans, and I'm rooting for the guy. He was always a guy I liked, coming out of TCU. Moving on to my number 5 team, also staying put, I have the Los Angeles Rams. I thought about flip-flopping these teams, but I decided to keep them at the last minute before recording this put. I felt like the Rams, they struggled a little bit with this Titans defense, which I've kind of, gassed up a little bit being better than most people thought, but Stafford was awesome, man, and he just continues to be awesome. His ability to, throw at all different arm angles and fit into tight windows is just awesome. He had a sidearm throw in this game that was just unbelievable, man, and he's just an awesome player to watch. And I still think that they're struggling to run the ball a little bit. I think that McVay will get that figured out with Kyron Williams and Blake Corum. They got the ball to Puka again. Devontae Adams really showed out this week. So I think that the Rams offense is clicking. And this defense, with Jared Verse and Braden Fisk and Byron Young and Kobe Turner and all these guys, I think has played pretty well. And, Chris Shula, another guy that's, we talked about Jesse Minter for the Chargers. Chris Shula is another guy that's, not working with the most premier talent. He's getting the most out of that defense. And he's a guy that I look, forward to watching his rise and being a potential head coaching candidate here in the near future. Moving on to my number 4 team, has an argument to be, 3-2 or 1 in my opinion, but I kept him put. I wanted to see a little bit more data from these teams. I have the Green Bay Packers, who really dismantled the Commanders on Thursday Night Football. I felt that, their offense missed a couple of opportunities to put more points on the board, but Matt LaFleur was in his bag in that game, man. And, Love, had some down moments, the missed touchdown to Matthew Golden, the missed touchdown to Wicks, he and the other deep ball missed to Golden. He missed a couple of throws, but he also made some really big throws. The one to Malik Heath on the sideline. Malik Heath made an awesome catch. The one over the shoulder to Jaden Reed, who unfortunately got hurt on that play. Jordan Love was making some really good throws, man. He looks really good. I liked what Matt LaFleur was doing with the run game, putting some more 21 personnel and 22 personnel and, more 13 personnel to try and get that run game going. And, the pre-snap motion with Josh Jacobs, I thought that was, something that I hadn't seen a lot of, out of Matt LaFleur, and I really like that he's, kind of tinkering with that. And, Jeff Hafley, can't speak enough about this defense, man. They were awesome. I mean, moving Micah Parsons all around the D-line, along with Lucas Van Ness and Rashawn Gary, and they just got after Jaden Daniels, and he was never comfortable in that football game. They made Josh Connerly look like a UFL tackle. I mean, they made him they just gave him fits. And Laramie Tunsil, they also gave him fits too. Micah was incredible in this game. Keyshawn Nixon had a really awesome game, couple of pass breakups. Bullard also had a really good game for them. I mean, this Packers defense is just loaded, man, and they could easily be, the best team in the NFL, but waiting for some more data here. And then moving on to the Buffalo Bills are my number 3 team, also staying put. I think you're going to see a little bit of a theme here for the top 6, but, the Bills boat raced the Jets. I actually picked the Jets to cover because I felt like, more recently they had played, the Bills pretty tough at home, but they made me look like a fool for taking the Jets, to cover. Josh Allen was, awesome in this game once again. They were able to run the football a little bit more with James Cook, kind of opened that up. Keon Coleman still looks pretty good, in year 2 here. And this Bills defense, despite not having Ed Oliver, really shut down the run game for the Jets. I thought that was pretty impressive for, that being, weakness of this team. So I think that the Bills, they just need to, continue, on the trajectory that they're going. I want to see them get, Shakir a little bit more involved. I felt like he's kind of been underutilized the last 2 weeks, and I know he was hurt, in training camp, so maybe he's, kind of ramping up a little bit. But, I'd like to see him get a little bit more use in that offense. Moving on to number 2, also staying put, I have the Baltimore Ravens, who, dismantled the Cleveland Browns. Lamar looked pretty good. They were not able to run the football, though, so that Browns run defense is legit. Derrick Henry just could not get going for whatever reason, so it was pretty much just all Lamar throwing. Tez Walker, Tylan Wallace, couple their lower guys on the depth chart, making some nice plays for them. 3 touchdowns between those guys, and the Ravens defense took advantage of Joe Flacco's mistakes. I think that this Ravens team still one of the best in the NFL. I would like to see them, get back to kind of their roots next week, run the ball a little bit better, against that Cleveland front is a little bit tougher, but, I'd like to see them do that. And, they kind of did about what they expected. They were pissed off from losing to the Bills. They kind of go out there, they beat the Browns, and now they got, a little bit extra rest. That Monday night game against the Lions is going to be a big one, and they got to come out there and prove that they are deserving of this number 2 team. And then at number 1, staying put, it is the Philadelphia Eagles. As much as I want to, jump on the Jalen Hurts, kind of hatred, because I'm, notoriously lower on Jalen Hurts than I think most people are, and he only completed, I think, like 1 pass over 10 air yards, and it was on a, all-out blitz. I think that Hurts did exactly what Philly needed him to do to win the game, the last 2 weeks, and, kind of what they needed him to do down the stretch for them. It's still really tough to stop that run game with Saquon and, Hurts being a factor in the run game. It's really tough to stop that, and I think that, that's the, big picture thing here for Philly. I know that their pass offense has kind of looked really like elementary, not being able to get the ball to Smith or A.J. Brown consistently. But I think in a vacuum that, really if you can't stop the run game, then it doesn't matter as much. And this defense is still pretty good. Secondary, I think, had a better week, although I will say they had a couple of balls that, to Tyquan Thornton that were overthrown by Mahomes. I think there was like 3 of them that he missed that could have been touchdowns, and we could be talking about a different result in that game. But I think for the most part that Philadelphia, played to their style of football there, and the exchange between Chris Jones and Jalen Hurts at the end of the game was pretty funny. So, Philly staying put here at the number 1 spot. So that concludes my week 3 power rankings. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below, what you have issues with, what you don't have issues with. And I look forward to doing this again next week. I didn't get picks out because, I was playing around with some stuff, in terms of recording, and it didn't come out, but I will have those out for you this week. And then I think I'm going to do a video on Friday, like a quiz or something like that. I think that would be, kind of a fun thing to implement, into the weekly schedule there. So look out for that on Friday too. But as always, everyone, have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Peace.